"Don't wander into the main hall," the curator said quietly. His smile pressed thin. "The important guests need space." The words hit harder than the winter wind outside. I had been invited, at least that's what the gilded envelope had implied, but standing there in the marble lobby, I felt more like a stray dog someone had let in to make themselves look charitable. When I arrived, the woman at the check-in desk had searched the guest list twice before writing my name on a blank ticket in hurried ink. No embossed lettering, no elegant font, just a smudge where I was supposed to belong. Inside, laughter spilled from round tables draped in silk. "Bring your camera," someone called across the room when they saw me, and a few faces tilted toward me with knowing smirks. I understood the implication. I was here to capture their night, not to be part of it. I stood near the back wall, the way you do when you've learned the safest place is where no one notices you at all. The museum hummed with the low music of wealth, glasses clinking, polite applause, careful compliments. The air smelled of polished wood and perfume, the kind that costs more than a month's rent. Critics clustered in tight circles, dissecting brushstrokes as if they were hunting for flaws that might make them look clever. Donors spoke about art the way bankers speak about stocks, pieces appreciating in value, collections worth protecting. To them, art was an investment portfolio, not something that could draw blood if you touched it wrong. I folded my hands in front of me, the way a mason might in a cathedral built from stones he once carried, knowing that no one here could guess which walls had been lifted by his back, which corners had been shaped by his hands. I let my gaze travel to the high archways in the new wing, pristine, flawless, and unfamiliar in the way that something can be yours in bone and breath, but unrecognizable in name. It was supposed to be a celebration, a moment for the city's finest to stand beneath spotlights and toast the art that would define a generation. But the only thing defining this night so far was the quiet knowledge that I was here by someone else's permission, and that they had already decided what role I would play. What they didn't know, what not a single person laughing at those tables could imagine, was that somewhere under those bright lights, under that carefully draped sheet on the main dais, was a truth I had built with my own hands, a truth that no amount of smirks, silken tablecloths, or missing invitations could erase. Friends, let's take a short pause. Write in the comments. Where are you listening to this story from? Have you ever experienced something similar in your own life? Don't forget to subscribe and share this video. This is how you help us grow our channel. Now, let's continue. I moved slowly through the new wing, letting my steps echo against marble floors polished so bright they seemed to swallow the light. The air here was cooler, sharper, as if the walls themselves understood the language of prestige. Spotlights bloomed over each display, careful beams sculpted to flatter every curve, every brushstroke. On the walls, plaques shone like small suns, bronze and brass plates engraved with names that seemed to float above the art they claimed to honor. Curators, patrons, benefactors. Their letters were perfect, the kind that would outlive them, pressed into metal with the weight of finality, as if history had already been decided and sealed. I traced my eyes over the rows of names and found no trace of the ones who had shaped the pieces with their bare hands. There was no mention of the craftsmen who sanded marble until the dust coated their lungs, no space for the calloused palms that had guided raw stone into form. No one recorded the quiet persistence of a man standing in a freezing studio at 2 a.m, breath fogging the glass, fighting the stubborn grain of material that resisted him for months before it finally yielded. Invisible is not just a state, it is a color. And I had worn it so long it had become my second skin. My hands, these hands, knew every contour of the piece hidden under that velvet sheet in the main hall, but here they hung at my sides like they belonged to a stranger. The work was mine, but the story on the walls belonged to others. I stopped in front of a sculpture I recognized. Not mine, but the kind of piece I understood down to its bones. Its surface was flawless, but I could still see the ghost of the chisel marks beneath the polish, a history erased for the sake of presentation. That, I thought, is what they do to people too. They take the roughness out of your name, the proof of your struggle, until all that's left is a smooth surface someone else can claim. The deeper I walked into that wing, the more I felt the air tighten around me. It was a place designed to make certain people eternal and others forgettable. And for years, I had let them keep me in the shadows, believing that the work was enough, that truth would find its way to light without my hand to guide it. But as I stood there, the hum of the gala bleeding faintly from the other room, I realized that invisibility doesn't fade on its own. It must be broken, cut into like stone, until the shape of who you are forces itself into the world. And tonight, whether they knew it or not, that shape was already standing in their halls, waiting for the moment the light would have no choice but to find it. Near the base of a tall marble column, I paused to take in the space, a sweeping view of the new wing with its high ceilings and carefully staged elegance. The stone at my back was cold, grounding, its weight pressing quietly into mine. I had always trusted marble more than people, at least it didn't pretend to be something it wasn't. From somewhere just off to my right, a low laugh rippled through the music and chatter. I didn't need to turn to know it was about me. Laughter has a way of finding its mark. I caught a glimpse of a young couple, polished in the way money polishes people who have never carried anything heavier than a glass of champagne. The man, holding a cocktail skewer like it was a conductor's baton, made a small gesture toward me, and his words, though meant to sound harmless, landed with the precision of a chisel strike. "He's just here for photos." The woman beside him, draped in silver satin, gave me the kind of look people reserve for staff who've stepped too far into the room. A quick up and down, an appraising nod, and then she turned away, satisfied her assessment had been correct. I lowered my eyes, not out of shame, but to protect something fragile inside me from cracking in full view. Their laughter passed over me like a winter draft sneaking in through a door left carelessly ajar, and like a draft it told me where the cracks were. Not in me, but in them. Cracks in their understanding of worth, of art, of the human hands behind what they admired. I leaned my shoulder lightly into the column, feeling the faint imperfections in the marble, small ridges and grooves the polish couldn't hide. Those flaws made it real. I thought about how many hours I'd spent coaxing form out of stone, how many nights I'd stood ankle-deep in dust, breathing in the story that only my hands could write. And yet, here I was, reduced to a nameless presence, a presumed bystander in my own chapter. The thing about moments like this, the careless insult, the easy dismissal, is that they don't just sting, they sharpen you. Every time someone underestimates you, they hand you another tool to carve with. I could have walked away, drifted to some quieter corner where their voices wouldn't reach me. But I stayed. I stayed because the cracks they revealed were also weaknesses in the walls they had built to keep people like me out. And I knew, with the patience of someone who's worked in stone, that walls, no matter how polished, no matter how grand, are never as solid as they think. Years earlier, before the marble took its final breath under my hands, there had been a meeting in a dim, book-lined office that smelled faintly of varnish and old promises. The curator had stood from behind his desk, crossing the space between us with the kind of ease reserved for men who are always sure of their position in the room. He reached for my hand, rough and ridged from years of shaping stone, and held it as if touching it might grant him some of its weight. "You shape, I shepherd," he said, his voice low, almost tender, the kind of tone that makes you want to believe. I had been carrying sketches rolled tight like scrolls, lines that had cost me weeks of sleepless nights and silent mornings. I unrolled them across his desk with a reverence that felt like confession. Every curve, every calculation had come from a place in me that didn't speak easily. Those pages were more than designs. They were pieces of my own private language. He studied them with careful stillness, and when he finally looked up, there was something in his eyes that made me think this was the beginning of a shared story. He asked for patience, for silence, for trust. "The right reveal," he said, as if art needed a season like wine, as if waiting would make the unveiling sweeter, truer, and I, still believing that those who promised to protect your work would keep their word, gave him not just my designs, but my quiet. I worked alone in the cold months that followed, every strike of the chisel a heartbeat toward a moment I thought we would both stand in together. When the piece was finally ready, I didn't see it again for months. It disappeared into the museum's preparation rooms, swallowed by walls I wasn't invited to pass through. At first, I told myself it was just part of the process, that somewhere behind those closed doors, my work was being cared for, prepared, made ready for the light. But when it finally emerged, it wore another name. Not mine. A name polished and pleasant, one that sounded good on invitations and plaques. My own was nowhere to be found, not even in the smallest type at the bottom of the catalog page. It was as if the piece had been born without a father, as if the hands that shaped it had never existed. That was the moment I understood. The partnership I thought I had entered had never been written down, never sealed in anything stronger than a handshake. A promise not signed is not a promise at all. It's a door left open for someone else to walk through and claim the room you built. And he had walked through it without looking back. I didn't confront him then, I didn't raise my voice. Instead, I did what a sculptor does best. I waited. Because stone teaches you that nothing, not even betrayal, is permanent unless you let it be. On the highest shelf in my studio, just above where the winter light crept in at an angle, sat the first maquette, the small clay model that had been my compass through the months of labor. It was nothing grand to anyone else, just a rough form, uneven in places, its lines not yet disciplined by the discipline of stone. But to me it was the purest version of the sculpture, untouched by politics, unclaimed by anyone's name but mine. The light that reached it was always late in the day, the kind that had to work its way through dusty panes and shifting shadows before it could lay itself down across the clay. That light was honest. It didn't flatter, it revealed. It didn't make the maquette more than it was. It showed it exactly as it had been in the moment I shaped it. My fingerprints were still there, pressed deep into the soft surface, ridges and whorls fossilized in a language only I could read. My thumbprints mapped valleys and slopes, like a quiet country no one else had charted. Every indentation was proof that I had been here, that my hands had known the shape of this creation before it learned to stand on its own. When the sting of their public laughter found me, when they nodded toward me at the gala with that knowing smirk, when the room swallowed my name and spit it out as someone else's, I would come back to this shelf. I would press my fingertips into those familiar valleys, fitting them into the same places they had once rested, like a key returning to its lock. And in that moment, I remembered who I was, not the silent figure at the back of a crowded room, not the man mistaken for a photographer, not a guest by permission. I was the one who had stood alone in the echo of a cold studio, coaxing form out of formlessness, asking nothing from the world except enough light to see the next line I needed to cut. I was the one who had carried the weight of the stone before it became beauty, who had listened to the stubborn voice of marble until it finally yielded to my touch. The maquette kept my secrets in the way only clay can. Honest, unpolished, loyal. It didn't care for plaques or speeches. It didn't need validation or applause. It knew the truth of what had happened, and that truth was carved into its skin forever. Sometimes, when the doubt threatened to take root, I would run my hands over the maquette until the ache in my chest softened. Because even if the finished sculpture now stood in another's shadow, here was the proof that it had been born in mine. Here was the origin the world could never rewrite, and I knew, as my hands rested on its familiar curves, that clay remembers more faithfully than people ever do. He arrived on a gray afternoon when the light fell flat across the floor, the kind of day when the air in the studio felt thick with suspended stone dust. I had been working for hours, my shirt clinging to my back, the metallic taste of marble in my mouth. The door opened without ceremony, and in stepped a man with a camera bag slung over one shoulder, and shoes so clean they almost reflected the room back at him. He moved as if each step risked contamination, his gaze darting over the scattered tools and stone chips like they were foreign objects in a world he didn't quite trust. I greeted him, but he only gave a polite nod, already circling the space in small arcs. The camera came out quickly, his fingers moving with the easy precision of someone who'd rehearsed the motion 100 times in cleaner rooms. He snapped a few frames from a safe distance, avoiding the workbench where the real mess lived. I noticed how he kept looking down, not at the sculpture taking shape, but at the dust under his feet, the shavings clinging to the edges of my boots, the faint white film on my skin. When he finally spoke, it was with the practiced tone of someone delivering a truth they thought self-evident. "No one will read process," he said, glancing briefly at the half-finished form under the cloth. "They only want product." I remember the way the words settled into the air, heavy but hollow, like a verdict given without a trial. No one will read process. It was the kind of statement that revealed not just his view of art, but the way the world too often treats it, skipping past the labor, the years of learning the stubborn temperament of stone, the blood drawn by sharp edges, the long nights when your only company is the sound of your own chisel. He took a few more photos, quick, shallow glances through the lens, and then packed up, brushing an imaginary speck from his jacket. By the time the door closed behind him, the sound of his careful footsteps was already fading, replaced by the hum of the studio's quiet. He left with pictures that would strip my work of its journey, reducing it to a single frozen moment, meant to be consumed and forgotten. I stayed. I stayed with the dust and the cold light, with the hum of my own breathing and the weight of the tools in my hands. I stayed because process was the part I couldn't live without. Process was the argument I made to the stone until it gave in. Process was the truth, whether anyone wanted to read it or not. And as I picked up my chisel again, I thought about how many people like him would come and go, stepping lightly to avoid touching the grit of creation. They would leave with their clean shoes and their neat stories, but I would remain here, in the thick of it, shaping something that would outlast them all. The hall was a theater of glass and echo that night, every surface polished to catch and return the light spilling down from a chandelier as wide as a crown. The guests shimmered beneath it, sequins, silk, polished shoes tapping against marble in an unconscious rhythm. The director stood at the center, one hand curled around the stem of a crystal glass, his posture that of a man who owned the air around him. He raised his arm, and the chandelier seemed to understand its cue, scattering a warmer glow across the crowd like it had been rehearsed. "To vision," he said, his voice carrying in measured waves across the room. Applause erupted, crisp, contained, the kind of applause that dies quickly because it's more for etiquette than feeling. I clapped too, a slow, measured sound, my eyes not on him but on the object hidden beneath the sheet at the far end of the dais. The edges of it showed through the fabric, lines and curves my hands knew better than my own face. The ache that rose in me was old and stubborn. It was the ache of watching something you created stand among strangers and act like it belonged to them. The ache of seeing your own work dressed in another's name, smiling in borrowed light, receiving praise that would never find its way back to you. My name wasn't printed anywhere. Not in the glossy program that had been left on every seat, not in the gilded signage at the entrance, not even in the murmured introductions that floated between tables. Yet despite their omission, I could feel my presence threaded through the room like a hidden current. Every photograph projected on the tall screens, the close-up of a chiseled fold, the sweep of a marble shoulder, the perfect shadow line under the curve of a jaw, carried my breath. My hands had been there for each of those moments, coaxing life from stone until it seemed ready to breathe on its own. I thought of the long nights in the studio, the air so cold it made my tools ache in my grip, my breath turning white before falling onto the surface of the marble. I thought of the times I stopped working just to listen to the sound of the chisel against stone, that ringing voice that told me I was getting closer to the truth. And now here it was, my truth, wrapped and waiting to be claimed by someone else. I didn't move closer. I didn't call attention to myself. I stood at the back, letting the light pass over me, the way water slides over rock, unseen but shaping the current all the same. There was power in that invisibility, I realized, because, while they could remove my name from their program, they couldn't remove my breath from the marble. And when the moment came to reveal it, I knew, though they might think the light belonged to them, it would still find its way back to me. The green room was a study in muted colors and forced calm, a quiet corridor tucked just behind the main hall where voices were lowered and smiles practiced like choreography. The air smelled faintly of expensive perfume and stale anxiety. a scent that seemed to seep into the walls and settle there, heavy and unyielding. I found myself there, standing off to the side, the weight of the evening pressing down like an invisible shroud. The curator approached with that same practiced smile, the kind that hides everything behind a carefully constructed facade. His eyes avoided mine, shifting instead to the papers in his hand and the tiny details that mattered only to those who wanted to keep things running smoothly. "Stand near the press wall," he said softly, as if giving me a position on a chessboard where my moves would be watched but never welcomed. His words hung between us like a locked door, an unspoken message that said, "You are here, but not here. You exist, but only in the places we allow." It was an erasure disguised as direction, a way to put me in the frame without letting me step into the picture. I said nothing. There are moments when words become too fragile, turning to dust the instant they leave your lips. I have learned to save mine for stone, the only audience that cannot betray them, that holds them firm beneath 1,000 winters. In that room, with its artificial calm and curated light, I felt the cold truth settle deep inside me. I was part of this night only in shadow, a ghost invited to witness a story that wasn't mine to tell. And yet, even as the door to the green room closed behind the curator, locking us both in separate silences, I held on to something no locked door could take, the unyielding certainty that my truth was carved deeper than their walls could reach. Outside, the murmurs of the gala pulsed through the thick doors. Inside, I breathed steady, listening to the faint hum of my own heartbeat, the sound of a man who knows that some rooms lock only from the inside, and some keys are forged in patience and grit. I stayed there, still and silent, gathering the weight of the moment, because when the world tries to erase you with polite smiles and whispered instructions, the only answer is to be heavier than the silence, more enduring than the locked doors, and stronger than the walls meant to keep you out. The catalog was handed from one polished hand to another, its pages still warm from the printer's press, the scent of fresh ink and gloss hanging in the air like a promise unfulfilled. Everyone flipped through it with the practiced enthusiasm of a collector admiring their new possession, eyes drawn to the name that gleamed on the title page in shining copper serif, slick, new, and fashionable. It was a name that carried weight now, a name that would be remembered and praised in the years to come. But my name was nowhere to be found. My sketches, the very bones of the sculpture, were buried deep inside the catalog's glossy pages, hidden behind sharp angles of attribution and carefully crafted euphemisms. The lines I had drawn, the measurements painstakingly calculated, the quiet mathematics that gave the piece its balance and soul, were all credited to someone else. There was a photograph captioned, "Private Collection," an empty phrase that felt like a lie so thin it could tear with the slightest breath. Private, but not private enough to keep the truth hidden from me. Private, but not private enough to hide the fact that someone else had taken the credit I had earned with sweat and silence. I sat back in my chair, the catalog folded shut on my lap, its weight suddenly heavy and awkward, like a burden I had been forced to carry without consent. The glossy pages, meant to immortalize the work, seemed to cough in my hands, a guilty sound, as if the book itself knew the story it told was incomplete, dishonest even. That moment, the betrayal inked in copper and gloss, was a fracture in time. It cracked the silence I had held on to, the patience I had nurtured like a slow-burning fire. But it also fanned the embers of a quiet resolve. Because while names can be stolen, and credit can be misassigned, the truth carved into the stone beneath the surface remains. It waits. It endures. The catalog was just paper. But the work was real. And the work carried my name, even if no one else could see it yet. I closed my eyes and imagined the lines of the sculpture, the weight of the marble, the hours pressed into every inch of its surface. I whispered to myself that one day the story would be told, not by ink or gloss, but by breath and presence. And when that day came, no catalog would be able to hide the father of this creation any longer. At 2 a.m, the world outside the studio quieted to a breath. The city's pulse slowed, leaving only the faint hum of distant streetlights and the occasional sigh of a night wind brushing past shuttered windows. Inside, the only sound was the steady, rhythmic tapping of chisel against marble, a sound so intimate it felt like a prayer whispered in a language no one else could hear. Justice, I learned, rarely arrives bathed in daylight or applause. It comes in these stolen hours, when the fatigue in your bones weighs heavier than the stone beneath your hands, when you've sanded the same stubborn shoulder of marble for the 5th time, feeling each scrape like a confession laid bare. You understand that justice is patient and silent. The marble listened to everything. It heard my doubts when I questioned if this night would ever come, when I wondered if my name would ever be spoken alongside the work I had birthed. It held the weight of my sweat and the ache of my hopes, storing them in its cold, unyielding depths. Once, as the chisel sang its relentless song, I whispered into the shadows, "We will tell them together." The words were half laugh, half plea. Ridiculous, perhaps, to speak to stone as if it were a companion, but sincerity has its own kind of logic, and the marble answered in the only way it knew, by learning my hands. Day after day, night after night, my fingers traced the curves and edges. My strength coaxed the form inch by inch until the marble bore the shape of my voice. It was no longer just a block of stone. It had become a language, silent, yet unbreakable. In those long hours, I was neither master nor servant. I was a witness and a participant in a quiet covenant. The marble held my secrets, and I held its story. Together we waited for the world to be ready to listen. The chisel's ring faded only when exhaustion folded me into sleep, but the bond between hand and stone remained unbroken. In the dark, I dreamed of a day when this silent justice would speak loudly enough to shatter the walls of silence built around my name. And when morning came, with its bright promises and hollow words, I returned to the studio, knowing that true justice doesn't rush. It doesn't glare in the sun. It waits patiently, carved deep beneath the surface, ready to be uncovered when the time is right. 2 days before the gala, when the city was already caught in the final whirl of preparations, the phone rang, a sharp, unexpected sound that cut through the usual quiet of my workshop. I answered with the automatic politeness of a man accustomed to being overlooked, expecting nothing more than routine. But on the other end was a voice, hurried and trembling, breaking through the usual scripts rehearsed in offices far above my station. "Sir, this is the registrar from the museum," she began, her breath catching as if she were trying to outrun a tide of doubt. I'm sorry to call so late, but the internal notes still list your working title for the sculpture." Her words stumbled out, raw and unfiltered, betraying the weight of a secret she hadn't meant to share. "And there's a video of the process, the one showing your hands shaping the piece." For a moment, I was silent. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because the shock of hearing that truth still existed, still lived somewhere beyond the polished veneer of the gala, felt like a baptism, a sudden cleansing that washed away years of neglect and quiet erasure. The silence on the line was heavy but filled with unspoken gratitude. When I finally found my voice, I thanked her, the words trembling with the fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, the story I had carried alone was about to be heard. Her relief came out in the softest of sobs, like someone who had spent years washing paint from their palms, unsure if the stains would ever fade. I could imagine her in that moment, an honest soul trapped in a world of polished lies, fighting to let the truth breathe. That call was a turning point, a crack in the wall of silence built around my work. It was proof that even in the coldest institutions, conscience still flickers, fragile but alive. And with that flicker came a chance, not just for recognition, but for justice. As I hung up, the familiar weight of stone under my fingertips felt lighter, as if the marble itself had heard the promise carried on that small, trembling voice. The night ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long time I felt the steady pulse of hope. Hope that the hands that shaped the truth would finally be seen, not as shadows at the edge of the room, but as the heart of the story itself. The museum's boardroom was suffused with the sterile scent of polished wood and unspoken regrets, a space designed to feel imposing, but not quite sincere. The long table stretched before me like a battlefield, crowded with faces that balanced carefully between curiosity and guarded defensiveness. I carried a box, simple, unadorned, but heavy with the weight of years lost and truths suppressed. Inside were my dated sketches, their edges softened by time-stamped videos capturing the raw birth of the sculpture, and the maquette, worn smooth in places where my thumbprints had rested in exhaustion and hope. I placed the box on the table and said nothing. For a long moment, silence filled the room like a tidal wave waiting to break. I let the evidence speak with the authority of stone carving itself, slow, deliberate, impossible to ignore. These were not just papers and images. They were the river that had carved a canyon through years of erasure and false praise. Someone finally broke the quiet, offering what they clearly thought was a compromise. "We can correct the plaque next season." The words hung there, a thin salve that suggested time might wash away the sharp edges of theft and denial. But justice is not a slow tide that eventually covers the footprints of wrongdoing. It is a chisel strike, precise and permanent. "No," I said, voice steady and firm. Those two letters were the first strike, the first crack in the facade that had been built to keep me silent. It was the sound of a man reclaiming what was always his, the story, the name, the legacy. The room shifted then. The air thickened with tension, the kind that fills a space before thunder breaks. I felt it too, the release that comes just before the storm, when the earth seems to hold its breath, waiting. My presence, my proof, were no longer whispers or shadows. They were the weight pressing down, demanding acknowledgement. I could see the flicker of uncertainty in their eyes, the uneasy dance between obligation and denial. But I stood unwavering, knowing that the chisel's edge is not softened by hesitation or delay. The truth, once struck, leaves a mark that cannot be undone. As I gathered my things and left the boardroom, I felt the air around me crackle with something new, possibility. The thunder had not yet come, but the winds were shifting, and when justice finally roared, it would not be a quiet thing. The gallery was electric with anticipation, a sea of faces lit by the glow of countless cameras raised high, each lens hungry for the moment that would define the night. The murmur of whispers, the shuffle of feet, the subtle intake of collective breath. It all converged into a palpable tension that wrapped itself around the room like a held note waiting to be released. At the center, the curator stood poised, fingers curling around the cord draped from the ceiling. With a deliberate tug, he sent the sheet sliding away, a silent curtain pulling back like a winter sky retreating before the dawn. The sculpture emerged, gleaming, majestic, breathtaking. Gasps rippled through the crowd, honest and wide-eyed, but beneath those startled breaths lay a quiet confusion. The piece was beautiful, undeniable, but for most, it was a new face wearing an old soul, a story half told. Then, as the last threads of fabric settled on the floor, the large screen behind the dais flickered to life. What followed was not the usual fanfare, but something far more powerful, a cascade of notes, rough sketches, and grainy videos, the raw and unvarnished journey of creation. Hands shaping clay in the dead of night, lines drawn with trembling precision, nights spent whispering to stone as if it could answer back. My voice filled the room, steady, unembellished, naming the muscles, the load points, the delicate balance that held the entire form in harmony. It was not just a narration, but a hymn to every unseen effort, every silent struggle etched into the marble's very bones. The registrar, caught in a moment of courage and conscience, had pressed play. She had chosen truth over protocol, transparency over concealment. And for the first time that night, the room listened, not to a polished speech, but to the dialect of evidence, the language carved by sweat and perseverance. Faces shifted as understanding dawned slowly, the initial shock softening into respect. The story that had been hidden behind glossy catalogs and borrowed names was finally being told in its full, unguarded form. It was no longer a whisper. It was a roar that demanded to be heard. I stood quietly, feeling the weight of years lift from my shoulders as the crowd connected with the real heart of the work, the hands, the hours, the silent dedication that had birthed it all. The split of the sheet was more than a reveal of stone, it was the unveiling of truth itself. And in that moment, justice did not come wrapped in grandeur or ceremony. It came in the honest light of exposure, raw and undeniable, breaking through the shadows that had tried to keep it buried for so long. The room had shifted in those moments, light bending in new ways, eyes turning from polished speeches to something far more raw and urgent. The director, sensing the change like a man caught off guard by a sudden storm, leaned toward the microphone with the practiced ease of a man used to controlling the narrative. "Tonight we honor the many hands," he began, his voice steady but faltering under the weight of a truth he had not anticipated. But the crowd no longer waited for his words. Their attention had been drawn away, pulled toward the small box resting on the edge of the dais. A box I had brought with me, modest but heavy with meaning. It sat there like a small courtroom, open and demanding judgment. Slowly, deliberately, I stepped forward. The murmurs softened into a tense silence as I lifted the maquette from the box. The small clay model, weathered and worn by time and touch. It was the child beneath the adult sculpture now standing tall behind me, the promise before the fulfillment. I placed the maquette carefully beneath the finished piece, aligning the origins with their outcome. The gesture was quiet, but it carried the weight of years, a visual testament to a story no catalog or speech could rewrite. "My name is all I came for," I said, voice clear and steady in the hush that had fallen. "And I brought proof." Those words were not a demand. They were a claim, a quiet reclamation of something that had been denied for too long. I looked out at the faces now fully focused on me, some shocked, some ashamed, others beginning to understand the depth of what had been hidden. The room held its breath as the director faltered, his carefully constructed narrative unraveling before the undeniable weight of truth laid bare. And in that silence, the name carved not just into stone, but into the very air of the gallery, echoed louder than any speech ever could. This was more than recognition. It was justice, carved not with hammer and chisel, but with courage and witness. And as I stood there, the distance between invisibility and presence finally bridged. I knew this moment would hold longer than any plaque or program could promise. The gallery was no longer just a space of art. It had become a stage for truth, and the name I carried would no longer be whispered in shadows, but spoken aloud, steady and unbreakable. The silence that followed my words was heavier than any applause could have been. They didn't clap at first. Instead, they listened, really listened. The room seemed to contract, every breath held tight in the space between what was said and what was understood. Cameras lowered slowly, no longer hunting for a spectacle, but capturing the quiet revolution unfolding before them. Someone fetched a plaque, its surface cold and blank, waiting to be inscribed with the truth long overdue. A pen was offered with trembling hands, the quiver in its tip reflecting the weight of what was about to be written. Promises, once whispered behind closed doors, were now etched into permanence as cameras found their focus, no longer on faceless speeches, but on the man who had carved his name out of silence and stone. The curator, who had once turned away and silenced my presence, faced me directly for the first time. His eyes were ungloved now, bare, vulnerable, stripped of pretense. He leaned in close, voice barely more than a whisper, offering an apology broken by the years of neglect it could never undo. His words could not put back what had been taken, but they carried the weight of a recognition that might stop the taking from ever happening again. Slowly, the museum staff unscrewed the temporary placard, the one bearing the borrowed name, and revealed a new one, engraved with mine. The letters were sharp, precise, and unyielding, standing against the polished marble like a testament to endurance. The room held its breath as the weight of that moment settled over us all, a quiet justice carved in stone and shared in silence. Outside, as the gala dispersed and the night unfurled its dark wings over the city, people passed beneath banners that now bore my name. They whispered it to one another in low tones, like a secret passed down through generations, something precious, something true. For the first time, my name was not a shadow, but a light they were proud to carry forward. I left the building without fanfare, without triumph. But the gravity in my chest was profound, the kind that holds a sculpture to its plinth, steady and unyielding, the kind that binds a man to his truth. It was a weight I welcomed, a quiet victory that needed no applause. In the end, justice was not loud. It did not roar. It was the steady, enduring presence beneath the surface, carved deep enough to remain long after the lights dimmed and the crowds faded away. And as I walked into the night, that weight carried me forward, steady, strong, and finally seen,